Yeah? Okay, great. Let's see. So apparently yesterday when after class I was talking to Kavita and Vanita, and they wanted to change the schedule for the classes. So there's going to be class tomorrow, is what they said. And there's going to be class on Monday, but then Tuesday, no class. And then Wednesday, test, and then Thursday, diplomas. Is that okay with people? No, that's no good? Still good? Still good? Yeah, I don't know. If there's a problem, we can ask at the end Vanita and Kavita to come in and talk about the schedule. But that's what they're proposing. Okay. So if anyone has an issue, we can talk about it after class. The exam then will be on Wednesday. Yeah. So I'll be here for the exam. I think we said it'll be at 3 o'clock, if I'm not mistaken, but I'll confirm the time. And it'll be 50 multiple choice questions. And then I'll get it graded. And then on Thursday there'll be a little, I think, ceremony is the plan, where they'll submit you your diplomas. Yeah. And that's basically the evolution of the class. Is that clear? For tomorrow's class, we're going to cover, just so you know, we're going to cover freedom of religion, and sexual orientation. Okay? Freedom of religion and sexual orientation is what we'll talk about tomorrow. All right, class tomorrow will be at 3. Again, if that's a problem for anyone, we can talk about it after with Kavita and Vanita, but it's the way that they wanted to schedule the classes. So again, tomorrow we'll do freedom of religion and sexual orientation. Yeah. Again, read what you can. Yeah, read really what you can. Yeah, that's read what you can. Okay, I realize that it's very close together, so you might not be able to do everything that's on the syllabus, but try and focus on the case law. I think that's really the most important. The book chapter that is listed here, you don't have to read. It's not in there. In the end, I did include it. So really, just focus on the case law for freedom of religion, and then the case law for sexual orientation. All right, and that's the schedule. What we're going to do today, we're going to continue talking about human rights from an American context, or from the Americas, and then we'll also talk about European human rights. Yeah, that's what we'll do the first part, and then after that we'll move on to freedom of expression. Yeah, and we'll take a look at the jurisprudence. I don't know if we'll get to all of it, but to get a general idea from a comparative perspective on how freedom of expression is treated in the United States and how freedom of expression is treated in Europe. If you read the case law for today, you can see that there's quite a difference in terms of how it is understood, how it's interpreted by the courts. So we'll talk a little bit about that from a jurisprudential approach. Okay? And any questions? Yeah. Okay. Just to sort of recall where we were yesterday. Yesterday we talked about human rights in an African context. We looked at the primary mechanisms in Africa, which were the African Commission and the African Court in Tanzania, Arusha, Tanzania, the Commission in Banjul, Gambia. And we talked about some of the limitations or some of the challenges that it faces from limited resources, limited government commitment, and then we looked at some of the overarching human rights issues. Not all of them, obviously, but what I thought were some of the big issues, and also how many of those issues were interconnected to its colonial past. Issues of, again, lack of freedom of expression, these strongman leaders that don't respect human rights, how a lot of them came up through the support of Western governments as a way of preventing the spread of communism, or at least that was the the concern at the time. So that's what we did, and then after that we switched to the Americas, and we talked particularly about the Inter-American Commission, the Inter-American Court, how those mechanisms function, and then also the primary document that's used there, the American Convention on Human Rights, which is a human rights document. Again, focuses a lot on questions of economic, social, and cultural rights. And then we also mentioned that within the Americas, we also have a number of other documents: the Convention to prevent and punish torture, on forced disappearance, and so on. And again, that also reflects its past relationship with over 100 years of dictators in the Americas. People like Pinochet, for example, arguably the Castro brothers, but ranging from Argentina to Honduras to Nicaragua. Wait, thank you so much. Okay, I can go home now. My chai has arrived. So that's where we left off yesterday. And then also we mentioned, again, that it is a more effective mechanism than the African system. It sees many more cases. There's a greater commitment, I would argue, to justice, but also there are limited resources. And we know that by looking at, although it's hard to see, there's a backlog of cases in the Commission of about 9,000. So although there is a stronger commitment, although there is, I think, greater development of a rule of law system, commitment to justice and to human rights in Latin America, although it has many problems, nevertheless, the court and the Commission are limited by lack of resources. Also keep in mind that in both the Commission in Africa and the Commission in Latin America, you have to first always go through the Commission, and then you can, on appeal or because of in compliance, you can get to the African Court or the Inter-American Court. Remember that? So once you've exhausted your domestic remedies, you can get to the Commission and then the Court. In very few cases in Africa, only 6 countries, I think, in total have now signed the protocol, individuals can go directly to the Court. But in all other cases, Commission and then Court, and in Latin America, Commission and then Court. Everyone follow me? Yeah? Okay. Am I confusing anyone? No? Okay, fine. If I am, just stop me, and I will explain. As we said, one of our favorite dictators, or not. Okay, we talked a little bit about again, some of the issues, the very high rates of gender violence, indigenous and minority rights, which are unrepresented. We don't even have a specific treaty that deals with indigenous rights, despite the fact that it's more than 10% of the overall population in the Americas. So that's something I think that many people have criticized the conventions or the inter-American system of not paying sufficient attention to the needs of indigenous communities, many of whom live in rural and isolated areas in the Andes Mountains and so on, that are not so accessible. Yeah. Okay. So let's then talk a little bit about. Come on in. How you doing? Good. Let's then talk a little bit about. This morning I was in the hotel and they bought me a chai, and I tasted. I said it doesn't taste as good as the chai here. Then I put in a thing of sugar, and then I said, okay, that's the trick. No, sugar is the trick to chai. No, is that? Okay. So in the United States, it goes without saying that we have human rights violations like any other part of the world. It is true that perhaps comparatively the types of violations that we see committed in the United States are not as much in the sense of torture or degrading inhumane treatment, although it absolutely happens. But there is a lot, on my feeling in the United States, and I think many would agree, that oftentimes it's a failure of the government to fulfill its obligations, right? If we look here, for example, African American poverty in the United States, we can see it's about 27%. About 10% higher than, more than 10% higher than the rest of the population. The number of males is greater. African American females or black poverty also we can see is significantly higher, about 12 percentage points higher than there. And that obviously comes, as I'm sure many of you know, as a result of hundreds of years of human rights abuses. Even though much of it happened before we had these international treaties in place, after hundreds of years of slavery, followed by institutionalized segregation that lasted up until, if I'm not mistaken, '65 through the Civil Rights Act under President Lyndon Johnson, came in after Kennedy. We've had really up until really the time that my parents were young, we had institutionalized segregation in the United States, which is undoubtedly a human rights violation. And had there been the Rome Statute of International Criminal Law in place, it would also have been a crime of apartheid, which is a crime against humanity. So the consequence of this, so this is the consequence of it: very high rates of poverty, the creation of slums in many parts of the country. If any of you have been to New York City, there are many areas in the Bronx and other places where we have these very big high-rise buildings of about 30, 40 floors. That are primarily minority, in some cases more African American, in some cases more Hispanic, where there are extremely high levels of poverty, lack of basic dignity in many cases, I would argue, basic resources and so on. And this has also come from the fact, in my opinion, that in the United States we've seen capitalism run wild. There's nothing wrong with capitalism, I would argue, but the fact is that it's gotten, I think, out of control in the United States, where we've seen massive stratification. New York University, for example, I think is about $65,000, $70,000 a year. The process for getting into university, the creation of ghettos and good schools versus bad schools, private schools versus not, the difference in quality, and many other factors has led to really, it's a tragedy in many cases. In the United States, a society that is so wealthy and has such potential or such ability to be able to provide basic economic, social, and cultural rights for the entire population. But nevertheless, we've ended up in a situation where we have extremely high rates of poverty. Nearly 1 in 5 people in the United States is poor, below the poverty line, and that is, again, for many institutional and structural reasons. Again, if we look at concentrations of poverty, again, same idea. We can see that African Americans have much higher concentrations of poverty in the United States than white people. And this is, although we rarely call it that, it is a human rights abuse, in my opinion. People have an adequate standard of living, as we know from our treaties. And again, the fact that so many people live in poverty is inexcusable. Another big issue is the rate of people without health care. Although, again, we oftentimes refer to health care as an entitlement, health care is a human right, right? It falls under, it's part of an adequate standard of living, it's necessary for life, yet we have, it's dropped down, but overall they say there's about 20% of the population, 25% doesn't have health care in the United States. And the healthcare system in the United States, if you don't have it, you can run into thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And that in itself, as we know, perpetuates cycles of poverty. People that oftentimes, because they can't afford to go to a doctor, well, they miss work, they get fired, they take on debt, they lose days of work, and so on. So I think, although we never talk about it in a human rights term, or just as of recently with the elections, with Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders have talked about it a little bit as a human right, but before it's always been treated as this idea of an entitlement, and that is incorrect by human rights standards. It is a human right. And again, in the richest country in the world, the fact that we still have these very high rates of poverty is just high rates of uninsured is a human rights violation. Again, the jurisprudence doesn't tell us that we need to make healthcare absolutely free. We don't need to necessarily go to a European system where you pay through a single payer system. You pay through your tax revenue. or like in the Nordic countries, in Spain, and so on. But what it tells us is that healthcare has to be accessible and affordable, right? And in the United States, it's not. It's quite the opposite. And then the other issue that we have is death by firearms. Again, even though many of these deaths don't result from the government's actions, nevertheless, we have, if we look at this, gun deaths in the U.S. death toll between 68 and 2017 eclipses all wars ever fought by the U.S. According to research by PolitiFact, there were about 1.4 million firearm deaths in that period, compared to 1.2 million in every conflict starting from the War of Independence to Iraq. Imagine, in just about, about 50 years, we've had more deaths than nearly all the wars that the U.S. has participated in combined. Again, we don't have very much discussion about this in the U.S. as a human rights abuse. The United Nations has brought it up, but in the U.S. you rarely ever hear anyone talking about this is a human rights abuse. But again, it's right to life. It's right to life, and the government not only has an obligation not to take away your life directly, right, through police or military or so on, but they have an obligation to safeguard your life as well. And in my opinion, the government has failed completely, and it is a human rights violation that I think needs to be imputed directly to the government. Okay, just to talk a little bit about the human rights system in the U.S. The United States really doesn't participate in the inter-American system. Questions of human rights are handled through the U.S. court system, with the Constitution being where we derive our rights from. The Constitution, unlike many constitutions that we have in the world, European constitutions, I believe Indian constitutions as well, the Constitution of the United States doesn't enumerate very many rights. There's a right to life, liberty, and property, and then from that, through a common law tradition, the government, or the courts, interpret rights. Really, the main focus of the Constitution is more on civil and political rights and not social rights. Any social rights that we do have, again, have come from this idea of life, liberty, and process, right? And property, excuse me. But the rest, civil and political rights, right to vote, freedom of expression, religion, right to bear arms, all of that is enumerated. So unlike other constitutions of the world, and there are some other differences as well, ours pays very, very little lip service to social and economic rights. The Indian Constitution, for example, I think is much more detailed, and that is the case with many constitutions, particularly newer constitutions. If we look at European constitutions, for instance, there is a much greater emphasis on education, right to work, right to housing, that really models more the UDHR and the international covenants. The United States, though, takes a much different approach, which we'll talk about. In terms of how the U.S. system works, as I said, we have a Supreme Court of the United States, which is based in Washington, D.C., made up of life-term members appointed by the government and approved by the U.S. Senate. Yeah. In the United States, just very briefly, we have two parallel systems. We have a state system and we have a federal system. Depending on the type of case, it can either go through state courts or through federal courts. In some cases, it could go through both. Constitutional questions, federal questions, generally speaking, go through federal courts. State courts can also hear those questions as well. All cases which include a federal question, a constitutional question, can be heard if the Supreme Court grants that right, can be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, but only, I think, if I'm not mistaken, about 10% of cases actually are granted that right by the Supreme Court. The rest are dismissed. Everyone know what I mean by that? Yeah. So there are about, I think, I'm not positive, but I think about 2,000 cases that get appealed to the Supreme Court from state and federal courts based on some federal question, but the court only accepts to hear about 10% of those cases, right? In cases where there are, for example, big divisions, for example, they allow gay rights here but not here, abortion here but not here. When there are those differences, oftentimes the court will will grant certiorari as a way to create one law. Everyone know what I mean by that? Right? Because what has happened, and this has happened with gay rights, is you had these states here supporting it, these states here no, some of these yes, down here they weren't. So a married couple, could get married in New York, travel down to Alabama, and their marriage wasn't recognized. What happens? You get into a car accident here, and suddenly one person loses their right to see or to have visitation for their partner, right? So that was creating all sorts of issues around the country, and eventually the case went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Everyone follow me here? So it's those types of questions. They also hear questions involving death row. When someone is on death row, they have a right to appeal directly, if I'm not mistaken, to the U.S. Supreme Court. So there are some instances, but what you should be aware as young lawyers is this idea that there are two systems. And if any of you do research into the United States, one of the things you need to think about is, is this a federal question or is this a state question? What jurisprudence do I need? So it's in some ways a tricky system. I'll just give you an example. Let's say, for example, we're walking down the street. What's your name? Oh, sorry? Agnivish. Okay. Is that Agnivish? Yes. Okay. We're going down the street, walking down by Agnivish, and we're in Manhattan. And I pull out my gun. I'm a good American. I have my gun with me, right? And I shoot him. State court or federal court? State court. Yeah, most likely state court. We go into the post office, federal building, and I shoot him. Federal court. Terrorism, federal court, right? Questions of interstate diversity over contracts, in some cases, federal courts. What other types of cases? Let's say I get a sex worker, I pick her up in New York, but then I take her across the river to New Jersey. Interstate, federal element. I bring a gun from North Carolina to New York, federal interstate. Could be a federal case. So lawyers spend lots of time arguing basic jurisdictional questions. Is it federal? Is it state? So you should just be aware that in the U.S. we have these two different systems. You can see here, state courts have a Supreme Court, an appeals court, and a trial court. And then federal courts have a Supreme Court, a Court of Appeals, and a district court, right? So there are two systems, but in both cases, when there is a federal question, they can end up at the U.S. Supreme Court in very limited cases. In most cases, I'm sorry, when we talk about the federal court, this is the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay? Otherwise, it's a district court, or what we call a circuit court, and a court of appeals. And then court of appeals is all of this has a court of appeals, there are district courts, and then one court of appeal, and then after that court of appeal, it can eventually get to the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay? And then within a state, trial court, appeals court, Supreme Court of the state, and then Supreme Court of the United States. So at the state level, there are 3 levels usually. Okay? And then in very limited cases, Supreme Court. Okay? And everyone understand that? Okay, good. So anyway, that's a bit. We'll deal more with the U.S. system once we start going through the jurisprudence. But that's generally how. How are we doing? But that is how the U.S. system functions. Those are, I think, some of the big issues. There are obviously many issues in the United States as well, ranging from gender inequality to questions of child rights and so on. But again, these are just a few that I think are quite interesting. Have any of you, based on your own knowledge of news, have you observed any particular issues in the United States?
Abortion, legalizing abortion.
Yeah, abortion is legal in the United States under a judgment called Roe versus Wade, which we'll see in this class. Sorry?
1973, it was legalized.
Yeah, exactly. But nevertheless, there's been a big attack on a. Sorry? Well, abortion is always allowed within a certain amount of time. But increasingly states have taken measures, particularly in the South, to make it more difficult to access abortions. They've put in place all sorts of regulations. For example, in some states, I think an abortion clinic has to be connected. Has to be connected to hospitals, for example. So there are very few that get the proper accreditation to be able to do it. For instance, in other cases, their parental consent is required. In other cases, there was, I think they still do it. They were requiring females to look at the child on a monitor first. That's been another. There's been increasing lobbying as women are going into abortion clinics to convince them against it. So even though abortion is legal in every state, the actual ability to access it. Where we have seen, I think, more difficulty is in the case of late-term abortions. Those that are in the, I guess it's the third trimester is what it is. And that, I believe, there are only 2 states in the country that allow late-term abortions, which are Colorado and New Mexico, if I'm not mistaken. So abortion, although it is a right within the United States, it nevertheless is increasingly restricted. And one of the, I think, big pushes now of the Trump administration is to continue limiting that right. Here in, is it legal here in India?
Yeah.
It is legal.
We have a medical termination of pregnancy act.
So yeah, the same thing. But then the same thing after 25 years.
But can you get it for any reason?
No, you don't have to. Medical reasons are sufficient.
Okay.
Yes.
So in the U.S., you don't, I mean, you can get it because of sort of an elective, no, because of choice. I mean, that you decide you don't want to have the child. Here you couldn't?
No, it's not that. Until up to the point when it is within the prescribed
time,
you don't need to have. But of course, if for the sake of legality of the same, you need to have the doctor's prescription which says that it's required for the sake of health of the mother or the child is not fit enough or these things. It's not just like as whimsical, you know, that I don't want. It's not.
Okay.
Though that does not criminalize necessarily, but this is the process. Because the hospitals have to have a record and justification of why they undertook the process.
And there's also a lot more female feticide, so that's why.
That's a big, It's interesting. Yeah, when I was working here, where I ran into those issues a bit of female feticide. And what that was interesting, but one of the consequences, which hadn't occurred to me, this was some years ago, is that it's caused increased trafficking of women inside of India, right? Because there are areas that really, I saw it in Rajasthan, but villages that had very few females in them. And those were villages that also had a lot of female trafficking, more sex work, sort of broad. Yeah, it's an interesting consequence of the fact that there is feticide as well. I mean, it's in Latin America. There is some of that as well. In many countries around the world, and it has been. And one of the consequences is precisely that it leads to more
Human rights violations.
more human rights violations. Interesting. Okay, then let's talk a little bit about Europe then. Any questions or any comments on the American system? Any other particular human rights that people? Yeah.
So how come that gun laws are so liberal in America?
Which laws?
Gun laws.
Good question. Gun laws. So gun laws are found under the Second Amendment, which is a right to bear arms, and at least originally it has a historical basis. We'll talk about that historical basis a bit more when we do the jurisprudence, but it's based on this idea of limiting government, right? This idea of, at least historically, this idea of after being a colony of the UK, this idea of we need to limit government, keep them as far as possible, and in the event that there is tyranny, that the crown comes back, we need to be able to defend ourselves, right? That's kind of the, in a nutshell, the sort of philosophical background. But increasingly, gun culture in the United States has taken off. Many people argue that it still has to do with this right to prevent tyranny. I mean, if you look, for example, under the Obama administration, in the first year of his presidency, I have to double check, but I think I heard that 200,000 guns were sold per month in the United States. As Hillary Clinton looked like she was going to be elected, gun sales were shooting up. I mean, it's this real kind of fear that government, under liberals, under Democrats, is going to be all powerful, is going to try and take away our guns, and we need to be able to defend ourselves against government. That's a big part of it. Another part of it is that people, much of the United States is fairly rural, and people believe that they have a right to defend themselves. I think part of it may even come from in the United States a certain culture of Wild West. This idea of every man for himself, this individualism. There's not this sort of collective sense of well-being, right? The United States in many ways is much more individualistic if you look at it compared to Europe, where again it's all about the collective rights of people, right? The right to healthcare here, it's much more about individualistic capitalism, this idea of everyone needs to look out for themselves, and one of the ways is my own security, and therefore I have that right. So there are many, there are many reasons. I mean, a lot of, again, it has its historical roots in this idea of needing to fend off big government, right? Protect ourselves from tyranny. When Obama begins to become a dictator, because everyone knew he was going to be a dictator, we need to be able to protect ourselves. I mean, a lot of it is that. A lot of it is, I think, sort of like a petulant child. This is my right, and I'm going to exercise it. And my roommate in college, for example, I went to his house. He was from rural Connecticut. He said to me, "You want to see my gun?" I said, "Well, fine, I'll see your gun, sure." I went down to his basement. He opened up his closet. He had about 80 guns. When his father came to we lived in New York City. His father was a police officer, so he was able to carry guns wherever he wanted. New York City gun laws are quite strict. And I remember he came over and he took off his jacket and he had 2 guns here, and then he sat down and his pants went up and he had 1 gun. He had 4 guns with him. And I said, why do you need guns? He said, well, because I'm coming to New York City. I've lived in New York City most of my life, and I've never had a need for a gun. When I said to my roommate, I said, why do you have so many guns? He said, because it's my right. Okay, fine. Another big reason in the United States, frankly, for that is, and I think this is one of the major reasons now, is the gun lobby. The gun lobby, has everyone heard of the gun lobby, the National Rifle Association? There's a lobby that gives millions of dollars to politicians. It's all transparent, it's legal, they're allowed to give that money. But they have fought for, extremely minimal gun prohibitions, to the point that you can have rifles, you can have semi-automatics. I mean, the recent shooting in Las Vegas, did anyone hear about that? 57 people were killed. It's because he was able to buy a semi-automatic, and he was legally able to buy something that kind of turns it into an automatic, basically. So a lot of it has to do with this money complex, that the NRA takes a lot of money, millions, hundreds of millions, from the gun industry and from military suppliers. So it's a whole chain of capitalism gone wrong. NRA takes from these people millions of dollars from the gun manufacturers, Smith and Wesson and all these companies. Then NRA is there to lobby for gun rights. They lobby for gun rights, and they sell it to the politicians. And politicians say, Second Amendment. And really, politicians in the U.S., they say, this is our right. I don't think because they really, very few of them at least, really believe that the Second Amendment is so absolute, but because they get thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars in campaign contributions. And frankly, until in the United States we take money out of politics, we're going to continue having these human rights violations. Same thing with healthcare in the United States. I don't believe that many, when Obama or when Bernie Sanders, or when they talk about legalized, when they talk about socialized medicine, you know what I mean by that, a public healthcare system? Immediately the Republicans say, this is communism. They begin to put advertisements on TV, of a woman in Canada whose mother had to wait 2 years for surgery for breast cancer and she died. I mean, it's very sort of anecdotal stuff. I've lived now in Europe for in total 9 years. We have a public health care system, and it is wonderful. It is wonderful. It's great care. It's functional. It's just as good, in my opinion, in the United States. But these politicians that take hundreds of thousands of dollars from the healthcare industry, they can't say to their constituents, I don't support healthcare because I take a lot of money from these people. So what they say is communism, socialism. It's a bunch of BS, no? But that is the reason. And so until we take money out of politics, we're always going to have this issue with gun laws. Again, the politicians sell it as Second Amendment, we need to defend ourselves. The real reason is because they get money. I mean, that in my opinion, is the real money. But the historical reason why the Second Amendment is there was to guard against tyranny from the crown coming back and so on. I mean, the way we won, the way we were able to push out the British was through arms, right? Was through a revolution. So we understand also the power of the right to own guns and the right to be able to protect yourselves from, foreign military, from an all too powerful government. Okay? Yeah.
I think the laws related to abortion in India has the human right and interpreted in its broader sense. Like we are seeing the human right of the child, of the lady as well as the child also.
Okay.
To take the birth is somehow related with the right to take a birth of that child also.
Yeah.
So we are interpreting the law regarding laws, making the laws regarding the abortion by seeing both the perspective of the child as well as the lady.
Okay.
I want to ask one question also. That is, human right is only restricted to the, after the birth, or it can be interpreted to a broader sense and give human right to the child also?
No, it's after the birth.
After
Is the way it is. Yeah. What is the UN position on abortion? Does anyone know? Does anyone know what the position is? No. What is the United Nations? The United Nations. Have they said that abortion is a human right? No, they haven't gone as far. But what they do say is that states should allow it. Is what they say. They haven't specifically come out and said it's a human right, but they do say that states should allow it, and in the event that they don't, it should be decriminalized on the part of the female, is what they say. That's the UN stance on it. So, yeah, no, it applies to once, because the question of when does a child or when does a fetus become alive, I mean, it's such a complicated question that it applies generally when the child is, once the child is into the world. Okay? Any other questions about the United States or about the Americas in general? No. So just the important thing to keep in mind is in the United States, when there is a violation, it goes to the U.S. courts. In the rest of the Americas, it goes up through the commission and into the court, potentially, into the Inter-American Court, okay? But in many ways, the U.S. system is much more insulated from the international Inter-American Court system, okay? Good. Yes?
So is there an optional protocol for the Inter-American Court?
For what?
For the Inter-American Commission, is there an optional protocol which countries sign to bypass the Commission and go to the court directly?
In the case of the Inter-American, I don't know. I don't believe there is. In the case of Africa, there is. But in the Americas, I have to double check. But no, I don't think. I know I'm getting confused with Africa. No, I think it always goes through the Commission. It's not an optional protocol. I'll double check just in case I'm mistaken. But I think it is. It's all through the Commission. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
What happens to the indigenous population, like who have in which jurisdiction they come, like in federal or state?
In where? In the United States?
In United States, like indigenous, because they have like separate territories.
They go generally to federal. They're under federal jurisdiction. Native American questions, I believe, go to federal courts in the United States. Yeah. Other. But it's federal land, I believe. What's given to them becomes federal land. That's given to the Native Americans. I think those questions. Are you talking about just Native American issues in general? Sorry? Yeah, of course, of course. Are you talking about Native American issues in general?
I was talking about the jurisdiction, like their cases goes to like federal or state.
They also have their own court system.
Their own separate.
They also have their own courts. They also do have their own courts, but they can go to federal courts, and I don't know whether they can go to state courts. I think Native American questions up for equality, discrimination, because they're constitutional questions, they can go to federal courts.
Like it's optional then.
They could also go to state courts if they wanted to. Yeah. But in most cases, I think their cases are litigated in federal courts involving Native American rights. Okay. I'm not an expert though in Native American rights, so I'd have to double check on that. But I think they have their own court system that oftentimes deals with local tribal issues. Then, if it's a question that involves a constitutional question, then it can go into federal courts. But oftentimes what they have are sort of, I guess, the equivalent of like customary courts in tribal area in the reservoirs, so in the reserves. So if there is some sort of question on the territory of Native Americans, then I believe it gets handled within the jurisdiction of these tribal courts. But again, if it's a violation by the U.S. government, for example, taking away their land without due process, anything like that, then it would go to the federal courts.
Like the missing case of that pipeline, I mean.
The pipeline, yeah, those I think have all been settled through federal courts. I believe so. Yeah. The pipeline, yeah. I mean, that's because it's all federal land, I think is what that involved, or a lot of it at least was. So I'm pretty sure that, I think that went to the federal courts. Okay, I can double check though, and I'll let you know, but I'm pretty sure it's the federal courts. Okay? Other questions? Yeah.
So is death penalty of minors allowed in the United States?
No, it's not. It was up until fairly recently, but it's no longer permitted. There was part of actually the arguments against it were based on customary law. That the United States was really one of the few countries in the world, this is when it happened, which I believe was 2005, which continued to put minors to death. It was us, it was China, Pakistan, Somalia, I think Saudi Arabia, and a few other countries. And so, there was, many people supported and certainly supported it at the time, but based partly on customary law arguments demonstrating that we were one of the only really developed countries in the world that still put minors to death. It was in violation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, even though we never signed it. That argument gave way to this, to the prohibition against putting minors to death, or putting individuals who were minors at the time of the crime to death, right? So even if you were 15 when it happened, but then you don't get tried until you're 20, you can't be put to death. Okay, here in India, can you? No, right?
Even if you're 50, you cannot.
It's the same idea, right? As long as when the crime was committed, you were a minor, you can't be put to death, and that's in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, right? I mean, it's cruel and unusual. Yeah. There was another hand there. Yeah.
Sir, in US, most of the states have prohibited or illegalized the prostitution.
No, very few states have. The only state that I know that has legalized prostitution is Nevada. Everything. What happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. No? As the saying goes. But actually, Las Vegas doesn't have it. It's Reno, which is a small city. And there they do have legalized prostitution. But as far as I know, it's the only state in the country where there is legalized prostitution. Everywhere else, it happens like everywhere in the world, but it is illegal.
Sir, then what about the access of justice to the prostitutes if they want?
Sure. Well, what we do have in the United States are lots of organizations and NGOs that support the rights of sex workers. Yeah, not necessarily the right to engage in sex work, but obviously the right to be free from violence, from abuse, because of many of them are addicted, obviously, to drugs. There's high levels of poverty in many areas. So they have advocacy. So in theory, at least, they have the same rights in terms of access to justice as anyone else in the population. Now, in practice, there are all sorts of difficulties. For example, many sex workers are undocumented. So they, particularly in today's climate with Donald Trump, when there's a big push to remove undocumented individuals, there is a big push to just suffer the abuse and not come forward, right? I mean, that's one of, whereas really they have a right. And actually, we have something in the United States called a T visa, which is a trafficking visa. And that is, if you're a victim of trafficking to the United States, if you meet certain conditions, I think if you're willing to assist in the prosecution and so on, you can apply for a T visa, which is different from just a prostitute, right? Different from an American, U.S. person who's there. But this is for someone who's been trafficked, trafficked into the U.S. illegally, they're undocumented. They can apply for a T visa, and that will allow them to stay safely in the United States, assuming they assist with the prosecution, I believe, and a few other requirements. And that's something that's been really important in helping to fight trafficking, because one of the big problems, obviously, is that women who are trafficked, they don't want to come forward. Same thing, they come from many developing countries where they don't want to go back. They suffered awful abuse. So they've created this. It's a federal legislation. They created this T visa status to allow them to reside legally in the United States and not be fear of being deported. And that obviously helps with access to justice, because they then are less reluctant to be. They're less reluctant to stay quiet. But yeah, I think it's a big problem, and another issue that we have in many states is that sex work is still criminalized. Sex work is criminalized everywhere, but it's enforced, and oftentimes it's the females. Now there is a move to decriminalized. There is a move, obviously, to provide support services instead of jail time. I did, for my master's thesis, I wrote something about sex workers in New York, and one of the big problems is what they call this revolving door status, right? Where they get arrested, they get sent to trial, the judge basically dismisses it, and then within 2 days they're back on the street, and they don't really have any help. No, increasingly there's alternative sentencing courts where rather than being sentenced to, and this is for sex workers in particular, rather than being...
so you don't have anything called rehabilitation or social security for those people?
We don't have, I don't think, social security for them.
Rehabilitation?
Rehabilitation, yes. Yeah. These alternative courts...
Coming back to street, as you pointed out, that's very shocking. Like once they are prosecuted, they are identified as people who are supposed to be in that business. So the state has a responsibility to provide for rehabilitation and alternative means of livelihood.
Yeah, well, we do have a welfare system that they can apply for welfare. That is true. So they can go on.
Not very accessible or like very limited.
Well, I mean, they have a right to it and they can get it, but so I don't know. I mean, they have to again. To get it, you have to have a legal status. You know, you have to be documented, I believe. I mean, there's lots of paperwork. I mean, there's lots of complications with getting it.
So you're not much better than us.
No. We're in the United States on issues of sex work.
No, I mean, don't mind, like this rate tapism, this is there. I mean,
Recidivism.
All the time we're talking.
Yeah.
We call it rate tapism.
Okay.
So there are files, and because we put a rate tape on the file.
Yeah. I mean, we have a big issue with recidivism in the United States of sex workers who just get sort of pushed back into the court system. Yeah, and it's a big problem. There is, as I said, there's more attention to sex workers than ever before. So in New York City, we have these alternative courts where rather than being sentenced to jail, you're sentenced to rehabilitation and group counseling, for example, right? So there is that to try and, but you know, they need more attention is what it is. I mean, there has to be special funds for them. There has to be more attention to taking them off the streets. You know, once they're putting them into shelters, for instance, safe shelters. There are lots of NGOs. There's an organization called GEMS, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in New York, that helps them, but there's not enough support. I mean, sex workers always are on the fringes of society, you know, and it's not. Fortunately, there's not enough attention to them. You know? Yeah.
So does the state provide any mechanism for making people aware of all these rights that are being introduced? What are the remedies? Do you have any system where you're making people aware of those rights?
No, I mean, you know. Making them aware of all their rights, or which?
No, you're talking about the sex workers. So in that particular case, what is the state doing in making people aware, making those sex workers aware that what is the aware in case they are prosecuted or whatever?
So a sex worker who is brought into the criminal, that is NGO work. Really, where they find out about.
The state is not involved in it like it should be.
It is involved on a certain level, but not as it should be. A lot of it, they don't get involved really until once they're inside the criminal justice system. Once they've been arrested, then that's when they oftentimes learn about their rights. But no, there's not enough outreach. There is some. I mean, when there are areas where sex workers stay in New York, for example, and there are organizations that go out that try and give them information about NGOs, who they can contact, safe practices, condom distribution, and all of that. But my understanding is that most of it comes from NGOs and not from the government itself. The government gets involved once there's a criminal justice issue.
Sir, how different is the condition of sex workers in countries like Netherlands, Denmark, say for Spain? No, not Spain. Where prostitution is legalized. Spain, no, right?
It's not legalized, but it's extremely common. They have big brothels that, because of a loophole in the law, that it's practiced.
So like these countries where it's legalized and the other countries where it's not legalized, how better or different is the conditions?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways on the surface they're better, right? I mean, they are, they're in safe spaces presumably, or many of them at least. They have access to social security systems. They have access to basic worker rights.
But the only thing, like, what I have perceived from what I have read is like the most important difference is that they can approach the legal system, but the trafficking is still happening. Say in Netherlands, the neighboring country, the prostitutes, the sex workers are being trafficked and brought to Netherlands, and when they come to Netherlands, they get accustomed to sex, like working in this type of in these type of circumstances, and then they can't actually go back to their country and live the life they used to live.
Yeah, well, so there are two things. So one is, I think, once they're assuming that they work in a registered brothel, which many of them do, they have basic they have workers' rights and so on. Now, it may be true that some of them, although you have to have working papers in order to work in a registered brothel. So I don't know whether they're trapped. But the problem is that like anywhere there's two economies, right? I mean, there's the legal economy for those who have working papers and so on, and then there is the illegal economy. And I don't know exactly what the size is in the Netherlands, but without a doubt, there are many workers in the Netherlands who are brought in illegally, who are trafficked in. But regardless of whether they're trafficked in or they're not, I personally don't support the prostitution, legal or illegal, because if you look at the studies in terms of what happens to them in the long term, I mean, these women work 5, 6, 7 days a week. I mean, you know, you're talking about 1, 2, 3 men per hour, 15, 20 men, you know, a day, having sex with women, trying to dominate them, engaging in, you know, practices that are probably, I mean, I'm sure most of those women don't want to subject themselves to what those men want. So the studies demonstrate that long term, even if they work in legal conditions, they're stigmatized. They suffer physical trauma, oftentimes. Psychological trauma. You know, there's high rates of suicide among sex workers, both legal and illegal. Depression. You know, other types of mental illness. I mean, just imagine it. No, I mean, for anyone, no, male or female.
Whatever, all these the consequences and the circumstances remaining constant.
Yeah.
Legalizing is something that always helps, whether it's drugs or prostitution. If it's a reality, maybe unpleasant, if we legalize it, we can, you know, attain them. The chances of exploitation, the chances of regulating the working hours, of getting their due pay, these are at least protected. See, the consequences remain the same. This is the vice of society, it is there.
See, for me,
legalizing is something that protects them. They are within the periphery of law.
in my opinion, though, in a place like, particularly in a place like the Netherlands, which is a high level of human development, or Germany, to me it's a poor excuse to say this is always going to happen, so let's just legalize it. I think what has to happen is
always protects.
There will always be some prostitutes, but the problem is, for me, basically what the government is saying, look, there's going to be prostitution, why don't we just legalize it, why don't we just, you know, let all these women let's give them legal status. And I don't think that's the answer, and I think the answer is to provide programs, to provide economic and social opportunities for them, rather than to legalize it. I think you're right, that there's always going to be prostitution, right? Whether it be in India, whether it be in the United States, whether it be in Spain. But I think particularly for a country that has resources, I think it's a poor excuse for the government to kind of just wash its hands of the problems. Because many of those women that go into it, they're already pre-existing drug addicts, they themselves have suffered sexual violence. So the government, rather than saying, okay, let's intervene and let's, you know, women who are potentially going to go into sex work, let's divert them into something else, the government says, let's legalize it and let's just let them work because they're going to do it anyway. And at least in my opinion, it's a poor excuse for a government to do. But anyway, there's both arguments. But anyway. Okay. Anyway, I don't want to go off topic. Okay, so our final and last system is the European system of human rights protection. In my opinion, the most effective system of human rights protection. When we talk about European human rights, we are talking beyond just the European Union, right? We're talking about all 47, 48 countries in Europe. Okay? Now, we have two parallel human rights systems. One being the European Union, and the other one being what's called the Council of Europe. I'll talk about it in a moment. The European Union applies only to member states of the European Union. Right? Everyone know about member states of the European Union? Western European countries, some countries in the East, Poland, Romania, and so on. Yeah, that's one system. And that system is governed by what's called the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Yeah? So in the European Union, we have the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which has 6 pillars. Dignity, freedoms, equality, solidarity, citizens' rights, and justice. Those are the 6 fundamental right areas of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. meaning that it only applies to individuals within the boundaries of the European Union. Everyone follow that? Yeah?
To the citizens only.
No, it applies to anyone within there. So if you are there and your rights are violated. Now, the way that this mechanism works is that it, when a country is implementing European Union law, right? What's called a directive or a regulation. Those are the two principal types of laws that come from the European Union. When those laws are implemented by a state, and that implementation in some way violates your human rights, you can take the case to the European Court of Justice. That is the court of the European Union. Everyone understand that? So, when a case comes, when a EU law in some way violates your human rights, only if it's an EU law, right, that is then implemented by the state, that is the only way you can take the case to the European Court of Justice. Now, the alternative, which we'll talk about in a few moments, is let's say Spain decides on its own to limit my freedom of expression. In that case, I wouldn't go to the European Court of Justice because that wasn't an EU law. Everyone understand that? I would go to what's called the European Court of Human Rights, which is in France, instead of Luxembourg. So let's say, for example, the European Union passes a law that says all countries need to crack down on hate speech. Okay? So Spain, in order to implement that law, creates legislation which lists as a category any opinions which offend. Everyone understand that? So that law is being transplanted by the European Union. It comes from the Union, and now it's going into Spain. In that case, if I want to challenge that law, I would go to the European Court of Justice because it comes from an EU law. Everyone understand that? The alternative, which as I said I'll talk about in a moment, imagine Spain, imagine I'm protesting in front of the Congress, and Spain says to me, you can't protest here. And they take out the water guns and they push me away. In that case, that has nothing to do with the European Court of Justice, or the European Union, and in that case I would go to a different human rights court. Everyone understand that? Based on a different charter. Okay? This is just sort of interesting, but the European Court of Justice, it hears all types of cases. So it's not a specialized court on human rights. It does human rights based on the 6 pillars of the European Charter, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, but it deals most of what it deals with, or a big portion at least, is competition law. Everyone know competition law? Competition law, antitrust, exactly, unfair practice, or dominant position. Have people heard of that? Yeah. Okay. So that's most of what it deals with. The European Union plays a big role. They have a concept of what's called state aid, which is states can't provide economic or other incentives to companies to come there. It tries to keep an equal playing field amongst the members of the European Union. So a lot of the cases that go through, there was a big case recently with Ireland giving big tax breaks to Apple. That was a case decided recently by the European Court of Justice. I was at the European Court in October. I direct a master's program, and we brought over some of the students, so they study European Union law, European business law, so we bring them over to look at it. What's amazing about this court is this court, you know, you're allowed under the European Union, because it's a basic human right to access to justice, to plead your case in any language of the European Union, right? Which are, you know, how many? 13, 14. You know, it's not a court that's run in English or in French, for example. It's run in every language, because if not, it's seen as a violation of access to justice. So the court spends somewhere about 60 or 70% of its annual budget on translation. It's an amazing, amazing. And there are 3 giant towers, the 3rd one's going up now, which are just translation towers. The average person who works for this court as a translator, legal translation, can translate, the average person, I think it's 7 languages is what they translate, in legal terminology, right? So we're talking about an extremely high level. And I think they said the person that does the most is 12 languages. that can translate. So you bring it in one language, and they can imagine that 12 languages. It's just amazing. The guy who I know who works there, he's Spanish. His English is just as good as mine or yours or any of ours. He also speaks perfect French. He does all of his work in French because decisions are authored in French there. And then Spanish. You know, I mean, it's just amazing. The guy, this tour guide who works there, who always gives us the tour. So when I go in there, he speaks to me. He's Italian. Italian parents. Raised, spent his whole life. No, one parent's Italian, one parent's Spanish. Raised in Germany, and has spent his whole life in Luxembourg. So he speaks fluent Spanish. He sounds like a Spaniard. I've heard him talk Italian. To me, he sounds Italian. His German, he grew up his whole life in Germany. And then English is perfect. And then his French is, they say, just as good as anyone else's. I mean, it's just amazing. It's quite something. But that's the European Union. In fact, I'll just tell you one other thing that's interesting about the European Union. So in Brussels and Luxembourg, because when you work for the European Union, you are a civil servant, right, of the European Union. And you know, you live in Brussels and Luxembourg, so they have these giant schools that are European Union schools. So that way, if you are, for example, Spain, and you're based in Brussels or you're based in Luxembourg, well, your child has a right to the Spanish system. So they have these giant schools where each school, within the school, it has the Spanish school, the Polish school, the British school, the French school. Do you know what I mean by that? The Italian, all within the same school. So your children can get a Spanish education in the same school as, you know, in the building next door. It's French students, the children of French civil servants, who can get a French education. I mean, it's really amazing. It's really quite something. So anyway, okay, that is anyway. So that is the European Union. Again, it's based on the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the cases against individual states for violating their rights based on the legislation of the European Union gets litigated in the European Court of Justice. Yeah. The second thing that we have is what's called the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe came about, I believe it was in 1950, and that is made up of 47 countries. Yeah. And the Council of Europe came up really, it was a post-World War institution at the time that the European Union, not European Union, at the time that the United Nations was beginning to form. And it sought to create greater integration post-World War II, particularly with the divisions at that time that existed in Europe between East and West. It sought to create more democracy building, social protections, and so on. And it created what's called the European Convention on Human Rights, which is something that we'll look at in a little more detail during the next few days. The European Convention on Human Rights is made up of, I believe it's 14 rights in total: freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and so on and so on. And violations by a state of those rights gets litigated in the European Court of Human Rights. Yeah. In other words, in other words, if, for example, Spain tells me that I cannot protest in front of the Congress, once I've exhausted all my remedies, right? You always have to exhaust your remedies to get to any of these courts. I can then take that case to the European Court of Human Rights if it violates the European Convention on Human Rights. Yeah? Everyone understand that? So for cases that are a violation by the state of the European Convention of Human Rights, I have a right, once I've exhausted my remedies, to go to the European Court of the European Court of Human Rights, which is based in Strasbourg, France. Has anyone been to Strasbourg, France? It's beautiful, isn't it? I'm going next semester. I'm going as a visiting professor to the University of Strasbourg to teach a similar course. Is it beautiful? No. Yeah, Strasbourg is an interesting city because it's changed hands a few times between being Germany and being France. No, so its architecture and its food is much similar to German food than to French food. It's right on the border of Germany. It's about 1 kilometer, and as I said, I don't know the history of the city exactly, but on a number of occasions, it's changed hands between the French and it's been a German city, French city, German city, French city. But it's a spectacular city. If anyone is looking for just a gorgeous city to go on their honeymoon or for a romantic weekend or whatever, right? Is that right? Well, I don't know if you know that pretty good, but. So, right, that's what academic purposes as well. That also is legitimate. It is beautiful, no, isn't it? I mean, it's a gorgeous city, and that is where the seat of the European Court of Human Rights is. And it's yeah. Anyways, it's a wonderful. I'm going to try to show you a video. It's not that long. It's only about 14 minutes on the European Court of Human Rights. I think it's worth seeing it, and rather than me giving you the overall history of it, we'll see if it works. If not, then. Can you hear? Can everyone hear?
Each year, tens of thousands of people who consider that their fundamental rights have been breached turn to the European Court of Human Rights. What is this court, which for over half a century has allowed individuals to have states held to account and whose decisions may ultimately affect our everyday lives? It was in 1949, in the aftermath of the Second World War, that a number of countries joined forces to set up the Council of Europe in order to promote human rights, democracy, and the rule of law across Europe. They adopted the European Convention on Human Rights, setting up a system that was unique at that time, including a binding supervisory mechanism. That was how the court came into being in 1959, reflecting the member states' desire never again to experience the atrocities committed in the mid-20th century. 12 states signed up initially. Now there are almost 50 of them. The court is based in Strasbourg, in the Human Rights Building. It is composed of one judge for each member state of the Council of Europe. The judges, who are elected by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, are fully independent and do not represent any national interests. In dealing with cases, the judges are assisted by the registry, which employs qualified staff from all the member states. The court receives hundreds of letters and phone calls every day. When applications arrive at the court, they are sorted and then dispatched to one of the units of the registry which prepare the files for the judges. All the decisions are taken by the judges, sitting as a single judge formation, a 3-judge committee, a 7-judge chamber, or a grand chamber of 17 judges for the most important cases. The procedure is conducted in writing, but in a very few cases, the court also holds public hearings, all of which are filmed and can be viewed via webcast. The court receives a huge number of applications every year. However, the vast majority of them are rejected at the admissibility stage because the criteria for applying to the court have not been met. For example, because the applicants have not first raised their case before the national courts. For that reason, the court delivers judgment on the merits in only a small proportion of the cases brought before it. It then rules on whether or not there has been a violation of the convention, and it may award financial compensation. Since it was first set up, the court has completed the examination of hundreds of thousands of cases. This is hardly surprising, given that the number of individuals covered by the system totals around 820 million people. That is the number of potential applicants living in the countries which have undertaken to comply with the convention. In reality, however, there are even more potential applicants, non-Europeans, whether they are refugees or other individuals who happen to be within the jurisdiction of a member state, are also protected. For instance, the court found a violation of the convention by Italy following the forced return of Somalians and Eritreans to Libya from where they had originally set out by boat for Europe. The court held that they would be at risk of ill treatment if they were repatriated.
It's within what's called the Council of Europe, right? Which actually I did mention it. It's here. This forms the court, the human rights mechanism of the Council of Europe, and is a post-World War II mechanism in the early days of the United Nations as a way of creating for now 47 states. One of the conditions to be in it, actually, the Council of Europe, you're not allowed to have the death penalty. Actually, although some countries still do use it, technically you're not allowed to have a legal basis for the death penalty. And anyway, so what you should just be aware of is that this is, in my opinion, the most effective court. It is a model, and it's been a model for the African court system. It's been a model as well for the Inter-American court system. And it's provided, I think, an example in many ways of how a human rights court should be set up in terms of, like everywhere. It could use more money, it is underfunded, but it is able to take on a tremendous number of cases. I think per year it receives, what did I see? 15 or 20,000 cases a year. Now, as they say, the vast majority of them are dismissed. They're inadmissible because they don't satisfy jurisdiction requirements. They don't exhaust all their resources, for example, or they don't have there's no claim that they make based on the convention. But it is a court that has provided really some of the most looked to and important jurisprudence on human rights issues, ranging from questions of abortion rights, to freedom of expression, to freedom of religion questions, and so on. And we'll explore some of the jurisprudence over the next few days, so I don't want to go too into it. Just very quickly, in terms of what I think are some of the big issues now in Europe. Actually, what I should also just mention is once a judgment is made by the European Court of Human Rights, the enforcement mechanism is the Council of Ministers. The Council of Ministers meets every few months, and it's made up of a representative of each member country. And what it does is it follows up on enforcement. Everyone know what I mean by that? In other words, they meet to discuss, to determine whether states have properly executed the judgments. So it's not only a court that hands down judgments, but then there is the Council of Ministers, which actually ensures implementation. Now, we obviously know that there's not 100% implementation by any means, but what this does is it seeks to follow up with the states and to evaluate their progress. And if you go to the website, actually, I brought an example for you, I think. Yeah. This is this week, actually, or shortly they're meeting. So this is the one for Germany. And as you can see, these are the issues that have come in concerning Germany. For example, absence of a speedy review of detention orders and unlawful continued detention, notwithstanding the expiry of existing orders. That was based on two cases. And then through this you can check on the status. So what the Council of Ministers does is it works with each state to ensure that to monitor whether there's been proper execution. So we have the court and then the council that work together to ensure that not only judgments are handed down, but that they are adequately implemented by the states. Okay. In terms of what I think are some of the big issues in Europe, one is what's called the Roma people, which you may or may not have heard of. These are gypsies. In fact, many people say that they have their roots in India. Have you heard that before? That they were a nomadic or a transit, what do you call nomadic or a transient group that going back hundreds of years, many left India, and now you can find them throughout Europe, particularly in the east of Europe, but also in Spain and so on. But you find a lot in Romania. That's how they've taken on, I believe, the name Roma people from Romania. But apparently, and I don't know the background of this that much, but they have some roots in parts of India. But they are a group that suffers extremely, extremely high levels of poverty. If you go to Spain, if you go really to France, they live on the outskirts of the city in slums. You can find oftentimes they live under train stations, under bridges, in rural areas, on little makeshift homes, and they're a group that suffers very high rates of human rights abuses. In terms of their children, there's child marriage, lots of sexual violence, physical violence against them. In general, there's lots of discrimination towards the Roma people. If you come to Spain, for example, every time you stop your car, they quickly come up and start washing your windshields. And again, these are groups that have not been able to integrate into most European societies. If you see in Spain, we have close to about 1 million people, and increasingly we are seeing more protections and more work on the part of the government to attempt integration. If I'm not mistaken, for example, Spain has and this is per, I think, EU orders, and maybe even from the Council of Europe, specific departments that work towards Roma integration. There have been a number of cases that have come in front of the European Court of Human Rights based on discrimination and so on of the Roma people. But again, it's a group that is continually abused and neglected in society. The next, refugees. I don't know how many people have been following the news, but Europe has been suffering a huge migration flow. One of really the biggest migration flows in modern history after the Holocaust, and also my understanding is with the partition of India as well, there was a huge migration, right? There were about 3 million people, someone was telling me, no? It was one of the biggest migratory flows. Well, this is, I think, since World War II, well, I guess it's, since I guess the partition, we've, over the last 3 years, we've received about 1 million migrants from all parts of Syria, other parts of the Middle East, Iraq, for example, and then also either migrants or refugees from sub-Saharan Africa, particularly from Nigeria, Senegal, and so on, that use the waterways, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, to cross. And I mean, it's heartbreaking. I mean, it's something that we see continually every night on the news. Young children washing up on the shores of Greece, of Spain, dead 3, 4, 5-year-olds, and it's been, I mean, in my time, really the worst humanitarian disaster, human rights violations that I've seen. The governments of Europe some are better than others. Spain, for example, in my opinion, has not been very good. There are many refugees sitting in temporary shelters around the country, but very few are being admitted into the country. Germany, for example, has made more of an effort to admit refugees, some of the Nordic countries as well, but it's a mass flow. And then if we look over east to Hungary, to Macedonia, where a lot are also coming in, the treatment towards these individuals has been terrible. Many states are in violation of the principle of refoulement, that they're just they're sending them back over to their countries. In many cases, they're suffering from physical and sexual abuse on these long migratory walks that they're taking. They're being beaten by very far right-wing groups. And another thing that we've seen sprout up over the last few years in Europe is a rise of right-wing nationalism. In England, for example, Brexit, that partly is as a result of these migration claims of migration. In France, Marine Le Pen. Has anyone heard of Marine Le Pen? A lot of her rhetoric was anti-immigrant in Austria and Hungary, and certainly in the United States as well. It's this very sort of nationalist rhetoric that is causing, I think, leading to many human rights abuses. And it's a tragic moment, I think, in modern European history when we see all these people coming. I interviewed a few months ago when I was in Luxembourg, actually, a woman who was she came from Iraq, and something that she said I'll always remember. She grew up at the time of the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, when the United States, people remember that? Iraq invaded Kuwait, and then the United States intervened. This was when I was a child, I think in '91. And her father was a military officer, and he decided, because she was quite young at the time, he decided he wasn't going to go to war. And she always remembers, she remembers that one day a black van pulled up in front of her house and took him away. And that was the last time she ever saw him. That Saddam Hussein or whoever gave the order to execute him. But anyway, so she grew up in Iraq, in Baghdad, and she was a journalist. And anyway, then the last war broke out with Iraq, between the U.S. and Iraq. And as many of you know, there's been a lot of fighting between Shiites and Sunnis. Everyone knows what's going on. And I said to her, if you had one wish for Iraq, what would it be right now? What do you think she answered? What do you think her answer was? I wish Saddam Hussein was back in power. She was the same person who ordered the killing of her father. She said she wished he was back in power. And for me, that was such a powerful statement. But what she says is that he held the country together. With his strong. Anyway, she eventually had to flee because she was doing, as a reporter, she was doing some work on corruption. She took, along with her family, she took a route. Eventually, she got to Turkey, and then she sailed from Turkey on a little boat to Greece. And she made it on shore. And then from Greece, she took a route, basically walking from there all the way almost to Luxembourg, with a train in between. If you think about how far that is, I guess it might be the distance of India, going from one side of India to another. It's I don't know how many, 2,000 kilometers or something along those lines. It was an incredible route. And she travels now around Luxembourg and the region, giving a talk called "What I Carried in My Bag." And it precisely deals with that question that when you have to escape your country and you're going to be a refugee, what do you put in your bag? And she put a few pieces of gold, some food, a change of clothing, and that was it. And that's what she traveled with to Luxembourg. It's a powerful story. It's a story that now millions of people who are crossing Europe are telling us. So crossing the Mediterranean are telling us. So that's one thing. As I said, the spread of European xenophobia. That's been the other big issue that we're dealing with, the rise of far-right nationalist groups. Same-sex marriage. We'll talk about same-sex marriage in a moment, so I'm not going to give you too much information on it, or we'll talk about it in a day or two. But you can see that not every country has same-sex marriage in Europe. Interestingly, Spain, which is a Catholic country, was one of the first countries in Europe to legalize same-sex marriage. But as you can see, most of Central Europe, and certainly parts of the East, either don't recognize it at all, or have some form of alternative marriage, like civil unions. Abortion laws also, by and large, in Europe, abortion is generally considered to be a legal right. We'll talk about it, so I'm not going to give you the jurisprudence yet. But you can see Ireland, which is a Catholic country, still doesn't have a legal right to abortion. And Poland, which is also a Catholic country, also doesn't have has limited abortion rights. Gender equality, again, interestingly, it very much corresponds to economic development, as it often does with the Nordic countries, having the highest levels of gender equality based on a number of coefficients, and then some of the southern European countries, which have were the second wave of European development. They were largely closed off until the 70s due to dictatorships, for example, Salazar in Portugal, in Spain, Franco, and they've always had lower economic levels of development. We tend to see a north-south divide in terms of gender equality. And then Turkey has quite a low level of gender equality, probably the lowest level within the region of Europe. And then last, freedom of expression, which is what we'll talk about the second half of the class. This was just a cartoon that came out last week. It's in Spanish, so I'll translate it for you. He says, the two guys who are in jail, he says, the guy, this guy says, I killed my grandmother with a drill. And then he says, and what did you do? And the other guy says to him, I publicly tweeted something offensive about a politician. And then the guy that killed his grandmother says to this guy, you must be crazy. You know? Everyone get it? So one guy says to the other guy, what did you do? He says, I killed my grandma with a drill. And then he says, and you? He says, I tweeted something offensive about a politician. And then the guy who put the drill through his grandmother said to the guy who tweeted something about the politician, you must be very crazy. You know? And that for me, I think, really kind of characterizes some of the problems with freedom of expression in Europe. So we'll take a break. We'll have a 15-minute break, and then we'll reconvene. Prudence, yeah? At a number of issues in particular. We're going to start with the question of freedom of expression, yeah? So when we compare the jurisprudence, we're comparing the United States Supreme Court to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, France, not the court of the European Court of Justice. Yeah, most of the human rights jurisprudence in Europe comes from Strasbourg, France, the European Court of Justice. And then I would like to ideally triangulate it to you to see exactly how the jurisprudence that we look at compares to jurisprudence in India. So let's first begin by asking the question: where do we get freedom of expression from in a U.S. context? And freedom of expression comes from the First Amendment. And if we read it, tell me what is unique about this. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, freedom of religion, or abridging the freedom of press, of speech, or the freedom of press, or the right of people to peacefully assemble, and to petition the government for redress or grievances, right? So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or abridging freedom of speech, press, or the right to assemble. What stands out about the way that this is written? Anything stand out about it compared to, for example, the Indian Constitution? Okay, but what does the Indian Constitution tell
I
us?
think there are no reasonable restrictions. Like India has specific reasonable restrictions
Okay.
along with the freedom of speech and
What is
expression.
how is it written though in the Indian Constitution? Okay. Okay. So is it written more like the European? Everyone has the right to freedom of expression?
Yes.
Okay, so the U.S. is, I think, probably the only constitution in the world where it's written as a negative right? Where Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or abridging the freedom of expression. Everyone understand that? So it's not so much this idea that you have the right to freedom of expression, but it's the idea that, which is the case, you have a right to freedom of expression, but it's more that government is limiting its intrusion, right? So if we think about this from a historical perspective, why do you think it's written like this?
Government was the one which was imposing restrictions on the people.
Yeah, it's very much influenced by our colonial period, right? This idea that in our early years prior to becoming a nation, and certainly in our formative years, there was a fear of too much government intervention, fear of the crown, right? Fear of government restriction. So the way our Constitution is written is not so much this idea of I have the right, but it's more about limiting the scope of government, right? And this is a debate that up until today in the United States manifests in different ways. The gun debate. We can call the gun debate many things, but at the end of the day, it is a debate about the size of government, right? Do we want a big government? Do we want a small government? Healthcare. Do we want big government? Do we want small government, right? Do we want more free market healthcare? Or do we want more socialized healthcare, right? So our history in the United States has focused a lot, ranging from social rights to civil and political rights, to this idea of laissez-faire, right? This idea of minimal government intervention. And that's the way that not every right, but many of our rights in the U.S. Constitution are written. It's not so much about giving me the right, but it's about limiting my right through its language. Everyone see that? Okay. Now let's take a look at the European Convention of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference. This is written much more aligned with the Indian Constitution, right? With almost every other constitution in the world. Yeah. But let's just read this. The exercise of these freedoms, since it carries with it duties and responsibilities, may be subject to formalities, conditions, restrictions, or penalties as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interest of national security, territorial integrity, public safety, for the prevention or disorder of crime, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, for the protection of the reputation and rights of others. So you have freedom of expression until it begins to infringe on the rights of others. For preventing the disclosure of information, or for maintaining the authority and impartiality of the judiciary. Yeah, everyone see that? So what we get is, in the United States, all it says is the government shall not do that. That's all it tells us. In the European context, it says you have the right to do this, but, similar to the Indian Constitution, up unto certain limits. This is a World War II, post-World War II convention. It's written in similar language as most other post-World War II European constitutions. Why do you think it's written in this way? Why do you think this language, why do you think it, what might it have influenced this?
The US one?
No, the European. The US is 1789, but the European? It's post-World War II, but why do you think they restrict freedom of expression in certain cases? What might have influenced it?
Sir, orange it might be defamatory.
Sorry?
Orange it might be defamatory to some extent.
Sorry, say again?
It might be defamatory to some extent.
Might be, sorry.
Defamatory to some extent.
Different?
Defamatory, sir.
Defamation. Okay. Okay. Yeah. It may be part of that. Let's read a little bit of the jurisprudence, and we'll see if we come up with some answers. Yeah. Let's start then with. Have people had a chance to read this, or at least a little bit? Sort of, maybe. Okay. Well, if not, I will. I'll lead us through it. Okay. So we're looking at page 140. We'll start out with the case of Brandenburg versus Ohio. The case from 1969. Yeah. This guy is valedictorian. So this is a case from the United States Supreme Court involving members of the Ku Klux Klan involving members of the Ku Klux Klan. Yep, and they're involved in a rally. Yeah, there's a journalist who's invited, and they say the following: "We're marching on Congress July the 4th, 400,000 strong. From here we are dividing into two groups, one to march to Florida, the other to Mississippi. Thank you." Then they say, "How far is the nigger going to?" Yeah, this is what we are going to do to the niggers, a dirty nigger. "Send the Jews back to Israel. Let them give back to the dark garden. Save America. Let's go back to constitutional betterment. Bury the niggers. We intend to do our part. Give us our state rights. Freedom for the whites. Nigger will have to fight for every inch he gets from now on." Everyone know the term nigger? Right? It's one of the worst words dating back to periods of slavery, a pejorative word, an extremely hurtful word for African Americans, right? So the question here, they're arrested, yeah? And what happens? Does anyone recall? Anyone recall? Okay, they're fined $1,000, right? Under criminal penalty. And the question is, do they have the right to say this, right? Do they have the right? Up until now, up until this point, 1969, there was a tendency to condemn certain forms of freedom of expression, particularly dealing with the issue of sedition. Those that sort of demonstrate, if anyone has heard of McCarthyism, the Red Scare, this idea, people who were espoused pro-Soviet communist ideas, there was a real, starting in about 1919 actually, even dating back, there were a number of acts which criminalized anything that was seen as sort of anti-American. This case is actually in many ways a turning point when we see the court sort of shed that sort of tendency to punish certain types of language, and this sort of opens up sort of a whole new era, I would argue, in freedom of expression protection. Yeah. What do they tell us here? Does anyone remember? Anyone recall? What is the standard that before they used? Anyone?
If that can increase the bad conditions, like violent conditions in the country, then it can be prohibited.
Okay, yeah, so what they say is that previously, the standard used in cases like this was clear and present danger. If someone's language presented a clear and public danger, a clear and present danger, excuse me, that was that provided criminal liability for their words. However, the court in this case says we don't agree with that language. We no longer agree with the idea that this type of language is acceptable, and they say that it sweeps within the condemnation of freedom of expression. Right? They say where is it? They say a statute which fails to draw this distinction, a statute that criminalizes what these people did, impermissibly intrudes upon freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment. It sweeps within its condemnation speech which our Constitution has immunized from government control. Right? That language which criminalizes offensive, bigoted, prejudicial speech, they say, still falls under First Amendment. Language which is hate speech, right? This is hate speech. They say is permissible in our society. They tell us. Yeah, everyone follow that? Let me just. Where is it? Now, why do you think they tell us this? Why do they say this? Why might they rule in this way, do people think? What do people think?
See, in India, we have this set rule that every freedom, we are having reasonable restrictions on it so as to ensure that everyone enjoys the freedom.
Okay.
The freedom of one doesn't intrude into the freedom of the other.
Right.
So that reasonable restriction theory, we have it in place in our Constitution itself.
Okay.
I think that's the idea.
I'm going to say, yeah.
Yeah, we had it in like 1950, we got it in place.
Okay.
This is in 1969, so that's the idea.
Yeah. So the United States is quite unique in that it is one of the only countries in the world that permits hate speech. Even though it may intrude on the rights of others by Indian standards, by European standards, nevertheless it is permissible under U.S. law. Everyone follow that? The argument here, there was one line that I wanted to sign.
America also promotes the individual rights.
Well, that's it. Exactly. That the U.S. is more interested in the individual rights of the person to be clear of government intrusion than it is worried about the collective rights of the rest, which is something that we'll see as a difference from European intervention or European protection. Now, what is the government concerned about here? The government, as we know, is concerned about this idea of too much state control, right, or too much state interference. This idea that they, I think, put forth here is essentially this idea that once the government has the power to determine whether or not, in opinion, okay, we're not talking about facts here, we're talking about opinion. Once the government has the power to determine whether or not, in opinion, is acceptable, not acceptable, it begins imposing restriction, or it begins imposing its own opinion, right? That is, if we leave it to a jury to decide what is acceptable and what is not, well, today one jury may say this is acceptable, and tomorrow another jury may say it is not acceptable, right? The moment we allow a judge to decide whether this language is acceptable or this language isn't, well, at the end of the day, although we like to think that the judge is applying his or her legal analysis, at the end of the day, they're applying their own subjective views on acceptability and non-acceptability. So what this tries to do, at least, is create somewhat of the U.S. tries to do, a neutral judiciary, or a neutral law, essentially, right? In the idea that almost all free speech, with limits, and we'll talk about it in a moment, but nearly all free speech is acceptable. Everyone? And this idea that just as I have a right to say this and that might offend you, well, on the same token, that gives you the right to say whatever you want, even though it may offend me. Everyone follow that idea? Yeah? And that is, I think, what is so key and so different about American jurisprudence on freedom of expression, is that it seeks, at a minimum, government intervention in free speech. Hate speech, perfectly acceptable. Is hate speech permitted here?
Yeah.
Is it? Any type of
It's
hate
part
speech?
of every society. It's
No. But we'll look at Germany in a moment. Look at Germany in a moment, or many other countries, for instance. Could you say something? Could you hear? There's nothing that's prohibited in terms of.
Hate speech is prohibited, of course, but hate speech is a part of our life. I mean,
Yeah,
it happens.
but legally.
No.
Legally, it's not.
Legal, of course.
Hate speech, hate speech is totally prohibited because according to sedition laws in India, if you can influence the dangerous conditions in the country, so that can be included in the hate speech. If there is a fair comment about the government or anything, any government authority, then that can include in the fair comment.
Okay.
So there is fair comment and hate speech.
Okay.
So fair comment is allowed, but hate speech is prohibited.
Interesting. So in the United States, we don't make that distinction. Hate speech. Could I go, for example, let's say to Central Park and say, we need to go and kill all the black people now? Could I say that based on this judgment? Because this is not just hate speech, but there is something. Does that create a clear and present? Does that create an imminent possibility of
instigating or creating and resulting in a crime or something?
Okay, so what I just said, could it be? What is the standard that they adopt in this case? So they say clear and present danger is not acceptable anymore, right? They say that it's too vague. This idea of incitement is too vague. What do they say here? Anyone recall?
So, I think what they said that it was maybe an action which would produce result into imminent lawless action in future,
Exactly.
like in the present.
An imminent lawless action, right? So that's the standard that they use, right? Is that it's no longer a clear and present danger. The words that they say there, let's go march on Washington, that was, some people said, a clear and present danger, right? This idea that they could march. But what they say here is that that's not enough. It has to lead to imminent lawlessness, right? That is the standard that they use involving speech. Imminent lawlessness. That some sort of words can lead to imminent lawlessness. What could potentially be imminent lawlessness? What if, for example, you're walking down the street and I start poking my finger in your face, saying, are you this, you that? Could that lead to imminent lawlessness? Yes. Because could the person just come around and punch me? Yes.
Something that invites a sudden reaction.
So fighting words, for example. That, they say, is prohibited. Fighting words. That is when someone's walking down the street and I harass them. Right? I start sticking my finger in their face, yelling at them. That, the court says, is not acceptable. That is that could lead to imminent lawless action. So fighting words is one prohibition of freedom of expression. But mere words, let's go put the blacks back in slavery, let's go get them. The court says no, that is not. It's said to the masses, that's not going to cause imminent lawless action. The court says, right? Fighting words, that sort of direct attack on you. There's even a case called the Westboro Baptist Church. Has anyone heard about that? They're a family in, I don't know, it's Kansas or Kentucky, that what they do is they go to the funerals of military members who have died in Iraq and Afghanistan, young 20-year-olds who have died in combat, and they hold up signs that say, "Thank God for dead soldiers," as the funeral is going in. Yeah, that's what they do. And the court here, and they often go, for example, to hospitals where women are being treated for breast cancer, and they hold up a sign that says, "Thank God for women with breast cancer." They believe that God is punishing the United States for allowing homosexuality, Jews to exist in the United States, and that each time someone dies because of a terrible cause, it's God smacking down. They call it a God smack. Yeah. This case went to the parents of a dead soldier, took the case eventually to the Supreme Court. What do you think the U.S. Supreme Court said about that case?
It's perfectly fine.
Perfectly fine.
Just mere words,
It's mere words. They even find that they're saying something of perhaps political importance, right? This idea of they believe what they're saying is a political statement against homosexuality, a political statement against Jews. And they basically say there is no right in the United States not to be offended. That in order to say certain things, we also have to be willing to hear certain things. And anything that has even some sort of minor importance, like what they're saying here, has to be heard. That's what they say. Even though it may arouse anger, offense, sadness, the court says that is not enough to prevent someone's speech from being violated. Now, if that father was walking down the street and I go up to him and I say, "Thank God for your dead son, I'm glad he died," well, that potentially could be fighting words, because that is harassment, right? Everyone see that difference? But I can't go into the funeral, it's a private property, but could I stand on a public street and hold up that sign? The court says absolutely. I most certainly can. Even though that is hate speech, again, the court views that as unlikely to produce imminent lawless action. And in cases where some of us would say, well, that would definitely produce imminent lawless action, the court basically says there, not amongst the rational man. The irrational man may be the one to strike that person, but the rational man will walk on by. Yeah?
So, rationality is fine, but then what about morality? Is there no consideration for morality?
No, none. No, that is the answer. No. I can say things that are moral, immoral.
When somebody is even insulting a group of people or something like for slavery and all, so there is also a human rights violation because they are violating their dignity. They're pointing out their dignity.
But in the United States, that's not recognized as being a human rights violation. That the idea is that we need to limit the scope of government, right? It's all about, it's not so much this idea that I may, because look at the Constitution, it doesn't say what the European Constitution says, where it might impede on the rights of others. This is about limiting my relationship to the U.S. government, right? Or what the U.S. government can do to restrict me. Again, with this idea of preventing tyranny, of preventing an all-too-powerful government. The moment that this judge here says, this is acceptable, it's the moment that the judiciary becomes empowered to begin deciding, based on his or her own opinion, this is acceptable, this is not. And when we think about how the U.S. has advanced the rights of African Americans, the only reason the rights of African Americans advanced was because of people like Martin Luther King. They didn't have the right to go to they didn't have the right to go sit in at a Walmart or at a store, but they had the right to freedom of expression. And with that freedom of expression, that ability to march down in the South, to march on Washington. I had a dream. Everyone, people know that speech? My mother was there, actually, when she was a young girl. that Washington speech. No, it was because of those words we were able to get civil rights protections for African Americans, right? So the way that homosexuals got rights in the U.S., marching, right? So we understand, I think, in the U.S. that the less the government can infringe, the more that rights can advance. The same idea also holds true for, very much it links to this kind of laissez-faire capitalistic society, whereas those ideas, what they say here, and in other jurisprudence that we haven't read, but let society judge for itself what is acceptable and not. Don't let the judiciary impose their values.
Just to add to that, it also implies two more things. One is like recognizing that your citizen or the people around there are responsible, and it tends to, with time, it tends to make them more responsible because they know that there's no distinction between the one who is speaking and the one who is at the receiving end. It all gets mixed up at the end of the day. So that probably makes them more responsible down the line.
No, precisely. When I was a young boy growing up in New York City, the Ku Klux Klan wanted to protest in New York City. Everyone, the Ku Klux Klan, they wear their white hoods. And the government of the city of New York said, no, this could lead to violence, lawless action. And what the court said was, absolutely not. They said, these people have a right to protest. Again, if I were a Ku Klux Klan, the last place I would want to go is New York City, no? But the court said, look, if you think there's going to be violence, you create a line, Ku Klux Klan here, police here, and everyone else there. And that's what happened. They had a permit for 2-3 hours. They yelled at each other for 2-3 hours. And then everyone went home. And there was really almost no incident. And that's precisely it, is allow society to debate these issues. Allow society to dismiss what it doesn't think is right. For me, actually, something that was quite interesting and that perhaps highlights this is recently in Charlottesville, there was a big rally of the alternative right, very sort of right-wing, racist group of people. There was violence because someone drove a car, but that I don't think is the norm in these places. But what ended up happening was that many of these people, the right wing, their photos were on Facebook, and their jobs, private sector employment, dismissed them. And for me, that's exactly what should happen. That if society rejects someone's values, they can reject them. Everyone understand now? It's another question of the public sector, but certainly the private sector. It's a way of allowing society to speak for itself. Meaning, if for example, one man who was a lawyer, he was there protesting. His law firm wanted to make it clear that we want nothing to do with your racist self. And they fired him, which they had every right to do. So that is society working for itself, right? But what they don't want, again, is this idea of empowering the government. Empowering the government to impose what is their opinion. Because if we think about it, going back to the South in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, no court back then would have given African Americans the right to protest, right? If they didn't already have that right. Everyone understand what I'm saying there? No court back years ago would have given homosexuals the right to protest. Now, times have changed and they do allow it, right? Or well, now times have changed and they can, obviously they had the right before, and they can protest. But the only reason they got to where they are is because of this ability to protest, to use language, to publish, to speak out their mind. So that has really, I think, informed the American psyche that the way we progress in a society is not by restricting this, restricting that, you can say that, you can't say that, sort of, as you say, infantilizing a state to an extent, but allowing a state the liberty on its own, the people, to choose what they want to hear and what they don't want to hear. And there are sometimes we hear things that we like, there are some things we hear that we don't like. But the idea is that as a society we learn to debate these questions and protest against these questions, but not silence those questions. Yeah.
So, sir, this imminent lawless action, this does not include civil unrest and violence.
What do you mean?
As in civil unrest, when the whole society, and there are revolts and there's violence created by a huge group, a huge number of people.
Yeah.
So the court, since you said that let society judge for themselves. So if there's some speech which incites violence, which incites civil unrest, it wouldn't be considered defamatory or as a.
Well, it wouldn't be defamatory, but it could be limited. If there was really something that was about to cause an imminent lawless action. I mean, if someone suddenly in Texas they all brought their guns and they said, let's go now and go kill this person. I mean, that could potentially be, again, we have to consider it based on real conviction, based on the reasonable man, but merely saying, you know, let's go march on Washington and send the blacks back to Africa. I mean, that's not going to happen. Everyone understand that? Now, what if someone, for example, says, you know, they have their guns and clearly they're about to do something. You know, we're sitting in a room and I say, you know, let's tomorrow go and kill this person. And we're really planning it. Well, that can be, I mean, that's imminent lawless action. Do you see the difference?
Yeah.
But certainly just, if I go to Central Park in New York City and I say, let's go send in the Jews, or let's go deport all Indians in New York.
So basically, the
Say that.
speeches which are on the face of it, defamatory or on the face of it, you can determine that it will incite civil unrest for sure.
Yeah. So, wait, say again?
So, the speeches, which on the face of it,
Yeah.
you determine that these speech will for sure
Yeah.
incite violence and civil unrest.
Yeah.
Alright. Also, another question, what about dissemination of false information? Say, because false information is itself not defined. Like,
Right.
you cannot really determine. So, if I publish something about someone, or maybe say a famous politician, and that the politician accuses me of false information.
Wait till we get to the case on the New York Times versus Sullivan.
Yeah.
We're gonna talk
Also,
about it.
the Ukrainian case, another one.
Yeah. Okay. Wait till we get to it, and then I'll mention it. But, I mean, we haven't gotten to the case yet, but we're going to talk about defamation. Okay. So this doesn't apply to that. So either by the end of today or tomorrow, we'll talk about that.
No. So, like, how will United States jurisprudence deal with it?
Like when we look at the case, I'll give you the answer.
Okay. So we're gonna compare all the jurisprudence when we come to that case.
Yeah, exactly. We're gonna defamation. We'll look at it only because if I tell you now, then we don't need to talk about it later. Okay. So just give me a few minutes, and well, what time? How are we doing with time? Okay. We have a little bit of time. Everyone clear on that case? Okay. Then I want to take a look at
So as we know, in America also the scope of freedom of speech and expression is very large and wide. So if somebody is violating someone's right of freedom of speech and expression, so there is a large society. One is saying this is right and one is saying this is wrong. So how will individuals decide what is acceptable and what is not? Is it not the duty of the judiciary to decide?
No, according to the court, no, that it's the duty of the individual to inform himself or herself, to learn on his or her own, but it's not the right. I mean, even if I spread information Donald Trump does it every day, right? I mean,
There is the least possibility that all the individuals will come over and decide.
There is a possibility, but the state doesn't want to get involved with it, because suddenly, again, who is to say what is false? Who is to say what is true? The government doesn't want to empower the state to have that, because then you enter into a slippery slope. Once the state can start determining what is fake, what is real, well, where does that stop? So the idea is, when we keep the state as far away, the judiciary as far away, that is the safest way. Think about, for example, Donald Trump sends out a tweet, or twit, or whatever, the tweet, and then a month later he denies it. No, I mean, that happens. He says, I never said that, and then someone says, well, you said it here. No, that wasn't me. I mean, right now, for example, there was right before the election, he made some vulgar language. Have anyone heard about it? That I can grab women, no, by their genitals. No? People hear that?
Yes.
Now the other day he's saying, actually, I don't think it was me. Let him say that. The judiciary would prefer to have him say that, and people can think what they want for themselves. What the government doesn't want to do there is start to get involved. Well, if we get involved with Trump, then this politician, and then suddenly these two begin to say things, and it enters into a slippery slope that the government is limited through the Constitution to keep as far back as possible.
If later on it concludes in the violent condition, then
No, even if it concludes in violence, I mean, many things conclude in violence. I mean, but the government doesn't see that as a reason. Again, it has to be imminent lawless action. Like you walking down the street and me, doing things to you. That is imminent. But the fact that, Donald Trump, what he says could one day lead to violence, the court says, well, that could be the case. Well, obviously it hopes it's not. But that in itself, that possibility of violence is not enough. And if that's the case, well then, the police will have to control the violence. But just because there's a possibility of violence, according to the court, that in itself is not enough it has to be imminent lawless action. It has to be a real, tangible likelihood, according to this jurisprudence, that that's going to happen. An abstract possibility of violence is not sufficient.
So this case laid down 3 elements for this imminent lawless action test. So one is intent, imminence, likelihood. So imminence, we got it. I understood it was to an extent, but like, how do you determine likelihood of how do you determine the extent of likelihood?
It's based on sort of a reasonable man's standard. So what would someone in that case do? We've seen very, very little jurisprudence on that, for example. I mean, for example, what about if I go down to the ceremony every year on September 11th, September 11th, yeah? I go to the ceremony and I hold up a sign that says, thank God for 3,000 dead people that died here. Would that be imminent lawless action? No. What if a father of, or a mother, there's a father, I think he lost 2 of his kids. If he's walking down the street and I start yelling at him, hey, I'm glad, I start pointing at him, I say, I'm glad your children died, I begin to really personalize it. Could that cause imminent lawless action? That I think the court would say, so I can't give you one standard, but it's based on somewhat of a subjective standard, but on the reasonable man, when is that person likely, so harassment obviously, really targeting my speech. So rather than saying I'm glad everyone died, if I start saying I'm glad you're, a real personal attack, I'm glad your son died, that's more likely to do it. So once it becomes more internalized, it begins to be repetitive, all of that, the court would say, is likely to cause imminent lawless action.
Wouldn't likelihood differ from a culture to culture? Like what is really sensitive in one culture may or may not be sensitive in another culture.
Yeah, absolutely. But are you talking about it in the US or elsewhere?
In other countries, also in the US, like different states have different.
Like she said also that morality should be subject
morality
to make law, but morality cannot be a subject to make law because morality before something is important for me and it is important for you.
And that is also though another reason, but that's also a reason for the court not to get involved. Precisely that. I mean, the United States is probably the most diverse country in the world. Do we want everyone's own perception of morality judging someone else's perception of morality? Right? So that is the idea, whether it be a judge or whether it be a jury. The idea is we keep government as far back as possible precisely for that, because once we enter into the game of judging opinions, we enter into the other jurisprudence says this, basically, we enter into the job of imposing morality or imposing individual standards.
So
and
the debate in like hard and pillar debate, which says like no matter what, we cannot really separate morality from law. No matter how hard we try, because law itself comes from morality, like the very basis of, because murder is not considered to be moral.
Right. Yeah. But what this Constitution does as much as possible try and separate, again, a government intervention, the imposition of morality on speech. No, the Constitution would prefer to favor open speech, regardless how immoral or moral it may be, as opposed to this idea of government imposing one standard of morality, which is something that we'll see through other jurisprudence. It does. No? And that, obviously, once you begin imposing that, it begins interfering with the free exchange of ideas. In Germany, for example, I cannot deny the Holocaust. Well, do I not have a right to deny the Holocaust? If I believe I have evidence, if I believe that Jews deserved it, well, that's my opinion. But how can we begin criminalizing that? At least from a U.S. standard, that's something that would be impermissible. There was a hand, yeah.
Yes, this discussion brings me to a dilemma. Like we were talking about reasonable restrictions, like freedom of speech and expression. That is, in US, they are not treated as an infant; they are free to express their thoughts and all. Do you think there should be a codification for reasonable restrictions or not? Like we have codification in India.
I don't. I think you begin to open the floodgates to all sorts of justifications.
Can you stratify me like a ratio of like US or any other standard who doesn't have that reasonable restrictions and they have their standard or level of thinking has been quite wide than ours?
Another country, you're saying?
Yeah.
The U.S. is really the only country that has that standard. I mean, every other country, whether it be
rather than that.
Sorry?
Rather than that, who doesn't excise?
No. It's the only constitution that I know that has these negative rights. Every other constitution in Latin America, As you can see in Africa, within the law, right, there's always limitations built in there. The United States, and that's partly why you asked why we study the United States. The United States is very unique in its interpretation of rights, such as freedom of expression. So, yeah, you're asking me for something similar to the U.S., no? Is that what you're asking? Yeah, I can't give you anything similar. Yeah, sorry. Is there another, yeah?
How can we balance safety with the right of freedom?
How do we balance safety?
Right to freedom of expression.
Yeah.
How can we balance? Actually, many of the cases we show that it creates many problems, like press.
Like what?
Press reporter said many things that creates many problems. How can we balance?
Well, are you talking about in the United States or generally?
Whatever with the country, but every country it has similar problem.
You know, from the point of view of the United States, again, there's a society and a democracy is healthier when all points of view are shared, whether they be true, whether they be not true. I mean, defamation obviously is a limitation to freedom of expression, but that society democracy is healthier when there is open debate. The moment we begin stopping a press story, or the moment we begin not allowing to publish one thing or another, or a book that's offensive, or that's xenophobic, Islamophobic, whatever, the moment we do that, I believe we enter into a dangerous course. Now, from the point of view, we'll enter into, I don't want to talk about the European perspective because we're going to talk about it in a moment, but from the U.S. perspective, there's not as much of a need, really, to balance that. That the idea is we keep it open as possible. We don't need to get into that game of measuring, right? Does that answer your question, sort of? Okay. Wait till we get to the government part, and then we'll come back to your question. Okay? Do you want to rephrase it, or no? Okay. Any other questions? No. Okay. Then I want to take a look at the government. At the how much time do we have? We have about 10 minutes. I want to take a look at Norwood versus UK. Norwood versus UK, which is the next case. So in this case here, we have someone who puts something on their window. He's part of a right-wing British National Party. He puts something on his window of twin towers in flames, and it says, "Islam out of Britain. Protect the British people." This is page 144. Okay, so he's arrested based on British law, where it says a person is guilty of an offense if he displays any writings, sign, or other visible representation which is threatening, abusive, or insulting within the hearing or sight of a person likely to be caused harassment, alarm, or distress. Could that law ever withstand scrutiny in the U.S.? No, that law would never be allowed. It is so subjective of what causes alarm, what causes distress, that without a doubt, that would not be permitted, as that would be unconstitutional in the United States. Nevertheless, in England it was permitted. This case went up on appeal to the High Courts of Britain, and the courts confirmed the judgment against this individual. He then, once he's exhausted all of his domestic remedies, he then takes the case to the European Court of Human Rights. What does the European Court of Human Rights say here? So the petitioner says that free speech includes not only the inoffensive, but also the irritating, contentious, eccentric, heretical, unwelcome, and provocative, provided that it does not provoke violence. So in many ways, he's saying, he's giving the U.S., right, this idea of imminent lawless action, right? That's what the petitioner is saying. Everyone follow? Now, he says criticism of a religion is not to be equated with an attack upon its followers. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, the court, however, differs, right? They cite to Article 17, where it says, nothing in the convention may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person any right to engage in activity or perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights of freedom set forth here. So what they say is, you have a right to freedom of expression under Article 10, but only as it extends to Article 17, meaning until it begins to impede or infringe on other people's rights, right? So there's a clear difference with the United States there, right? The United States says you have this right, right, even if it infringes. The idea is this right protects you from government interference. Everyone follow that? Whereas here they say you have this right, but only up until Article 17, where it begins to infringe on the rights of others, which is, I think, similar to India, right, in that respect. So what they say here is the poster, what he put on the window, right, in question in the present case contained a photograph of Twin Towers which said, "Islam out of Britain." Yeah. The court notes and agrees with the assessment made by the domestic court, namely that the words and images on the poster amount to a public expression of attack on all Muslims in the United Kingdom. Such a general, vehement attack against a religious group, linking the group as a whole with a grave act of terrorism, is incompatible with the values proclaimed and guaranteed by the Convention, notably tolerance, social peace, and non-discrimination. So, if we compare this jurisprudence to the United States, what does this seek to focus on? The freedom of expression or the Convention versus the United States. Here, what they're more concerned about is collective peace, right? Collective non-discrimination. How do you think that links back to Europe's history? What happened once Hitler and other fascists began to show up in the beer halls of Munich and start yelling, "For the Jews, let's kill the Jews"? What happened? It led to a genocide, right? It led to crimes against humanity. So there's a real fear here, or even we could say a compensation here, read into this, that what we need to protect is not the individual right of someone to say something, because history, and recent history in Europe shows us that when we give that person too many rights, look at what could happen, a Holocaust. So what we need to do is not focus on someone's unabridged rights, but instead focus on the rights of those who are being trampled on. Historically, the Jews, the Gypsies, and so on. Everyone understand that? So it's more about, in Europe, protecting the collective right, and less about the individual right. And in the United States, based on our history and our relationship to communism, to the British, it's more about this idea of protecting the individual right, and less about this collective right. Everyone see that difference? And that idea, and this is what we'll spend the next 2 days on, will, to an extent, will sort of permeate through a lot of the jurisprudence, and will inform, to a large extent, how human rights, particularly civil and political rights, are interpreted differently between the courts in Europe and the courts of the United States of America. We have a few minutes. I'll just give you a few more for examples, and then tomorrow, if we have time, I want to take a look at a fantastic video on just an interview with another case that we're going to read about, called Virginia v. Black. Fantastic interview with the lawyer. I think I mentioned it, and he really captures, I think, the spirit of the American Constitution. But there was recently a case or an issue that came up in Spain where there was and this to me highlights the problem. There was a bus that was going around Madrid that was anti-transgender. And it said on it, men have penises, women have vaginas. That's what it said. There was another bus that went around. It was by a comedian who does has a sort of a funny political show, who's more left-wing. And it said, basically, I forget exactly what it said, but people have many things, or something like that, right? And so the mayor of Madrid gave the order. She's a very left-wing mayor. The anti-transgender bus, no. Other bus, yes. And although I don't agree with the bus, the anti-transgender bus, nevertheless, it left me angry that both buses weren't allowed to circulate. And for me, it highlights the problem of allowing government intervention here. Because tomorrow, we can have a conservative mayor of Madrid that says, anti-transgender bus, yes. Pro-transgender bus, no. Everyone see that? Once you empower the government to make that decision, they begin picking and choosing what is acceptable and what isn't. And for me, this case really highlighted. One more point that and this is a big problem now in Europe. There was, everyone knows the attacks in Paris, right? There was the caricature of Muhammad. There was the Je suis Charlie. People aware of that, where people started marching and they said Je suis Charlie. Someone posted on Facebook, Je suis, with the name of the person who committed those attacks. What happened to that person? They were put in jail. And that, for me, highlights a big issue in Europe, in that that was seen as hate speech. Whereas I think, at least for me, that was political speech. That person wasn't advocating imminent violence or violence at all. They were merely saying, I support the actions of this person. We may we may not agree that killing people is the answer. I think all of us would probably agree. But does that person have a right to voice support for those actions? That is, for me, that was a political message. Those actions, those killings, were saying, that person was saying, we don't agree with the characters of Muhammad. We don't agree with what's going on in the Middle East towards the Muslim community, right? So for me, and I think from a U.S. perspective, that is political speech. And it may be hate speech also, but it's also political speech. It was a message, right? The United States, even in sort of these strange cases like the Westboro Baptist Church, they're able to find political speech. And that's something that really, for me, is an important and, for me, actually a proud element of U.S. Support of freedom of expression. That even speech that many people would consider hate speech, thank God for your dead children. That, for me, it's political speech, right? There's a political message behind it. Je suis, I forget his name, Kamel or something like that. That's a political message. Maybe hate speech too, but it's also a political message. And the problem is that the government then gets into the business of creating double standards. So for the Parisian, Je suis Charlie is okay, but for that Muslim individual, Je suis Kamel is not right. And then the government gets into, I think, a dangerous game of picking and choosing. And suddenly, particularly in Europe, where there is a lot of Islamophobia, where there is, particularly in Paris, a large marginalization of the Islamic community. They live in the outskirts of France. For me, that just compounds it. Everyone understand what I mean by that? That once the government starts saying, these Muslims can't say that because it espouses support for violence, but the Parisians, yes, or that is a dangerous and I think unfair game for governments to have that power to do that. It may offend people that person says, Je suis Kamel. Maybe offend them. But there's also a political message behind that needs to be heard, that needs to be discussed. And the moment, and this is, again, what the United States would say in response, the moment we begin preventing that person from saying that, we end all political debate. That person has a message that should be heard, that should be discussed. We may protest against that idea of killing people, fine, but let that person voice their political message. Let them voice what they want to say. And then let's openly debate it. Let's discuss it. But just saying, Je suis Charlie, this was wrong and the caricatures were fine, that's not healthy debate for society. That's not real democratic debate. And we begin, going back to what you said, we begin to infantilize a society where this may offend people. You can't say that. You can only say the majority opinion. And that, at least by U.S. standards, it's not perfect by any means in the United States. I'll talk about that tomorrow. But nevertheless, I think it makes a strong effort to protect that civil and political right to freedom of expression, with at least attempting, not always successfully, to create a blanket neutrality. And that's why, as I said when I was talking about human rights in Europe, I believe that human rights in Europe right now is under serious attack, both in terms of majority opinions, but also minority opinions. Let me just give one quick example that I also thought was problematic. Recently in Holland, there are strong hate laws there, hate speech laws. And a politician some years ago, he said something like, that was anti-Moroccans. He was arrested for it. Fine. Recently, he made another comment. He said, we need to kick all Moroccan scum out of the country. And he wasn't arrested for it. Why? Because right now there is a wave of Islamophobia sweeping across Europe. So the problem there is, should the government be picking and choosing? When there's Islamophobia, that's acceptable. But when there's not Islamophobia, that's not acceptable. Everyone follow what I'm saying there? And that is the danger of government, that when we have political, social waves happening across Europe or anywhere in the world, when we have politicians that think one thing or another, judges that are more conservative, less conservative, once we allow them to begin intervening on free speech, we allow too much, in my opinion, imposition of what is morals and what isn't.
But then, this is a big debate and it will go on and on.
Yeah.
But then the whole idea of law, there is such an element of discipline. that we try to instill in society is that we would have never needed it in Constitution, you know. So, I mean, that's the bottom line, I think.
Well, or
something that goes on.
But there are limits, as we said. Imminent defamation, right? I mean, it's not that there are no limits. But what is law there also to do? It's to protect democracy, right?
You can't be a fanatic for the freedom of expression or against the freedom of expression. US is almost fanatic for the freedom of expression.
Yeah.
You have to have the elements of that.
But
So
let's. Sorry.
So what about more instigation?
Instigation?
Yeah, you were speaking about the Charlie Hebdo case. In that, when someone writes "G Swiss Charlie," but the other one who is actually writing something about the people who attacked the Charlie Hebdo, the newspaper and everyone who printed all those, but that is actually instigating more action against
Well, but that person wasn't online saying, let's go kill people now. That would be conspiracy, right? That would be, in that moment, inciting violence, right? I mean, certain discourse, that could be, I'm going to go now, let's go now to this store and do this. That's not, but merely voicing support for the acts is not inciting violence. It's supporting the acts because those acts had a political message behind them.
That's a big question.
The person who committed those acts was not necessarily crazy, or person was someone who was voicing a political message at the end of the day, right?
The possibility of his being crazy cannot be.
Well, it could have, but
the possibility of being, it leading to a.
Okay, but even if they were, at the end of the day, there was a political message behind that.
Because in a society there are a lot of people. What instigates what action we cannot predict.
Well, you're saying what is instigation and what isn't?
Like, especially like if Donald Trump said something about pro-white supremacy, and that instigates a lot. Like in America, the majority of people are white, and instigates white supremacist action. So that is also instigation. He just says a speech, but it instigates the people because he is the leader.
Well, so it's true. We have a big problem in the U.S. with white supremacy. Two possibilities. One is where I'm standing outside of a store where there are African Americans, and I call up my friends and say, we need to go in and attack them now. Instigation? Imminent lawless action? Yes. Another thing, I stand outside the store and I say, I believe all blacks should be sent back to Africa. Is that, or am I voicing a political opinion?
It's all so subjective. It's not. You just cannot standardize it.
Well, but it's not that. I mean, they're two very different things. Let's go do something, and let me voice support for an idea. And those are two different. Anyway, I know it's past, so I don't want to keep it. We'll enter into for tomorrow. We'll continue on freedom of expression because there's a lot to debate. I want to talk more about the Indian, some things in India, and then we'll go on to freedom of religion. And if we have time, we'll go on to, what did I say, LGBT rights. Okay? Good.
Thank you.